Okay, where was I? So I don't know exactly what you heard, but I'll try and start from where I left off. My involvement with this case initially was actually quite indirect. While the ACA was being debated and initially first challenged in court, I was a law clerk for a federal trial judge in Pennsylvania. And as a law clerk, I wasn't allowed to get involved in litigation. I couldn't file any briefs. I couldn't really, do too much with it, even though I was very interested in it. So I watched from a distance. A lot of my friends, like Randy Barnett and others, who were some of the key movers in this case, they were moving at a very fast clip. And I was able to keep abreast of what they were up to. So at the time, I kept a blog, and I wrote down a lot of blog posts about the case, what was going on, recent developments. And as the time went by, I realized, wow, there's so much here that this is a case of a century. I think there might be enough to write a full article about it. And I said, well, maybe I can write 2 articles about it. I said, wow, there's enough for maybe a like little Kindle ebooks, so single books. So maybe I'll write one of those. And then by the time I got till 2012, when the Supreme Court was about to resolve the case, I was like, wow. However this comes out, this is going to be a big deal. Or to quote Joe Biden, I won't use a real word, a big effing deal, as Joe Biden said. And then I was able to obtain a publisher. I was able to obtain a book deal. And the book came out in a very fast clip. The case was decided in June of 2012, and my manuscript was due December of 2012. So you can imagine that I rushed very, very hard that semester, which was my first semester of teaching, to get the book done. But in hindsight, it was a wonderful project. And although the book's only about 1.5 years old at this point, I'm already writing a sequel. The sequel will be called Unraveled, Obamacare, Religious Liberty and Executive Power, which tells the story of the subsequent challenges of Obamacare involving the contraceptive mandate and some other tax subsidy stuff, which I'm sure you people are fascinated in. But today I'm really interested in talking about the constitutional challenge to Obamacare. So enough from me. I'd like to hear from you. And Moyne, I don't know how you want to do this camera thing, but let's make sure we don't hang up, and we'll. Yeah.
We can hear you loud and clear now, so that's great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose the questions. We'll start with the first one, get your response, and then I'll open it up to the floor if anybody wants to follow up with subsequent questions, discussion, or make a point, and we'll take it from there. So one of the themes, so the way this course works is everybody has to post 3 comments or questions. It's like Judge Ginsburg's reading the course, so that's basically what I've done here. Book a week, and every week everybody has to post 3 questions or comments. So, and then we summarize the comments and questions and discuss. So I tried to get the questions that I thought were appropriate for you. So the first one, a theme that ran through a lot of the commentary was, is this really a conservative victory? Yes, the Commerce Clause was affirmed, but it was saved with the tax. Is this is saving a statute of conservative value? Is finding a penalty, which is supposed to be punitive, is finding it to be a tax, which is merely, there's a whole body of literature about the differences between taxes and penalties. So does this, at the end of the day, really, is it a victory for liberty? Is it a victory for conservatives or libertarians?
Sure, and that's a very good question. So how do we assess the value of NFIB? Like, how do we assess what this opinion actually means? I don't see this as much of a conservative victory. And as I'm sure you read, the final opinion of the court saved the individual mandate in its entirety by rewriting it as a tax. This, in my sense, is not a conservative approach to jurisprudence. This is quite a, if I can use the word, an activist approach, where the court imposes something that Congress never did. As we discussed in the early parts of the book, the president went out of his way not to make this a tax. The United States Congress went out of its way not to make this a tax. The reason why, the United States, as in Canada, taxes are not popular. People don't like taxes. So it's unsurprising that this law was not designed this way. Yet the second they got the court, the Justice Department, which litigated the case, said, oh, guess what, by the way, this is a tax. And the first judge in the United States to actually accept this argument was John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the United States, the top of the Supreme Court. So I think that aspect was not particularly conservative. Now, somebody say, well, we have this entire opinion about the Commerce Clause, right? Isn't this great to have all this, all this case law? But ask yourself, what other aspect of American law is in jeopardy because of this ruling? Anything short of a purchase mandate, and by that I mean the government requiring people to buy stuff, the federal government requiring people to buy stuff, what else is unconstitutional, right? In other words, because of NFIB versus Sebelius, the Obamacare decision, what other laws Congress enacts might be unconstitutional? And I think the answer is really not that many. So whatever benefit may be gained by having this new Commerce Clause case law, I think was greatly overwhelmed by the harm and cost of making these judicial gymnastics of finding a way to rewrite the law and uphold it and save it.
Anybody want to jump in? Some of you had some questions. Mr. Khan.
Okay, so is that really your
I'm sorry, I can't really hear. Could you come closer to the mic, maybe?
Okay, maybe come to. Sorry.
Sorry. I appreciate it.
I mean, is it really that big of a deal if the individual mandate is changed to the wording of a tax? Basically, I mean, it seems what you're saying is basically that the really big issue with that is just public opinion of one wording as opposed to the other. I mean, it just doesn't seem that big of an issue, considering if that is the major issue with switching the wording from individual mandate to tax.
And thank you for the question. It's an absolutely fair question. Like, you're asking yourself, right, what's the big deal, right? What's the big deal? Maybe you weren't following this, and you probably wouldn't have any reason to be following this, but in 2009, when this law was being sold, it passed by the skin of its teeth. And you read this in the book, it passed with just enough votes in the Senate and just enough votes in the House. Had anyone even suggested briefly that this law was a tax, we would have no Obamacare, right? So it's very easy for the Chief Justice 2 years later to say, oh, what's the big deal, let's treat it as a tax. But in reality, this frustrates the entire deal on which this law was created. And I think that's an act of judicial hubris that is not consistent with the Supreme Court's role. What makes this even more tenuous is the Chief Justice said, this isn't actually a tax, but let's just pretend it's a tax. So it's a hubris coupled with sophistry, which makes for a very bad blend.
Okay, we got another question. Jay's coming up here.
Hi there.
Hi. Does it really make a difference? I mean, whether it's a tax or not. I mean, I agree that it's not a victory at all. I mean, what I read from this is that if you have a case that comes to the court under the Commerce Clause, and if it doesn't make it under the Commerce Clause, you can simply turn around and say, well, it's a tax. So one way or the other. I mean, it's 6 of one, half dozen the other. The way I see it. I mean, particularly if you have a judge who can simply reinterpret the statute. This really isn't any kind of victory at all for liberty. What this really does is it simply reiterates that the institutions, political institutions in the United States, including the court, can just basically disregard personal liberty and just impose whatever policies they want on the public. Would you agree with that, or am I misinterpreting something?
No, I think that's a fair characterization. I would even take one step back and say, who is the biggest party impacted by this decision? I think the answer is not the court. I think the answer is Congress, and let me explain. If you're Congress and you're considering passing a law, and you know it would be really unpopular to call it a tax, right? You can just say, okay, let's call this a penalty and avoid the political unpopularity of this, and once we get to court, we'll defend this as a tax. In other words, it allows Congress to shirk the responsibility of their own decisions. This entire doctrine that the court will save Congress from its own mistakes by saving something as a tax frustrates the entire political process. One thing which you may not be familiar with, but in our Constitution, taxes must originate or begin in the House of Representatives, not in the Senate. Obamacare began in the Senate. So in that sense, the Senate because it wasn't a tax. There's actually another case challenging this. But the problem with the tax-saving construction wasn't just a matter of judicial interpretation, but I think it screws up in many ways how Congress behaves when they're considering to make these types of new laws.
Yeah, Josh, actually, I think we have the same, because in Canada also, tax bills have to originate from the House of Commons, which is the equivalent.
Oh, cool.
We get it from the same British legal tradition.
Yeah, I think Parliament, the old tax that you're originating in Parliament, the House of Commons, not the House of Lords. I'm guessing that's the progenitor of that.
Yeah. Any other questions on this? Yeah, Shad, why don't you come up here?
Hi. So my question is, don't you find that there could be an exception to me? Now I understand how this sets a dangerous judicial precedent in terms of it, but in terms of just looking at it, I mean, you said it as there's these dangers that they can set these purchase mandates when, I mean, if you look at Canada, there's a single-payer healthcare system, and that has started a regime of Canada forcing you to buy things. And on the other hand, looking at the background of healthcare in the U.S., like you mentioned the problem where there were freeloaders who could, you could still show up to the ER and insurance, you would get treatment. So there was kind of background that led to you needed some system in place, that there was this aspect that health is rather fundamental. So I'm just wondering, balancing that, is there a bit of a justifying the means for making this exception for healthcare?
Okay, thank you for the question, and I think it's particularly fitting that I'm giving this talk to a bunch of Canadian law students where Canadians have had health insurance provided by the government now for decades. In the United States, at least among some people, it's viewed a little bit differently, that health insurance is not viewed as some sort of right that you have, and also that the fact that you can't afford it doesn't necessarily mean it's the government's problem. But let me engage your question this way. Do the ends justify the means? I have to think that's what Chief Justice Roberts thought. He thought that this was a massive piece of social legislation. It would have radically changed a significant portion of the U.S. economy. And I think he simply recognized the fact that for the court to invalidate this in an election year, recall 2012 was a presidential election year, that could have seriously impacted the reputation of the courts. Okay? Do I agree with that line of thinking? I don't. I don't think that's a valid method of judging, because Roberts' own opinion says this is unconstitutional. If that's the case, if he really believes it's unconstitutional, end it. That's it. End the opinion. Don't go on to these entire contortions, because I think the lasting damage to the court by saving it is actually even worse. And let me explain. What's happening now? There's a Supreme Court case about Obamacare being litigated as we speak. And predictably, all the people on the left saying, "Oh, Chief Justice Roberts, don't invalidate this. Think of all the people who will lose their health care. Think of all the people who lose their health insurance." So now in perpetuity, whenever any aspect of the Affordable Care Act is challenged, they're going to have this lingering background of, oh, well, they can't really uphold the law because if they do, people will lose their health insurance. I think that's a very dangerous way of judging, and I don't like the precedent that sets going forward, because it gives a license to try to influence the court in ways that are, I don't think, appropriate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions on this before we move to the next? Okay, very good. So let's look at the next question. A few people took issue with the term unprecedented, and I know you tried to weed throughout the book. So some of the issues they brought up, various students said your omnibus, President Clinton's Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1993 had no GOP votes. Bush's Tax Relief 2003 Act had no Democrat votes. They're compelled to do things like jury duty, filing taxes, military service. Buck and Bell, if you remember, Oliver Holmes talks about all sorts of things we would be compelled to do. So why is compelled to buy health insurance?
It's amazing how many people ask him at the title. I found that absolutely fascinating. So, okay, where did the title come from? Very early on in the litigation, Professor Randy Barnett, who teaches at Georgetown, gave so many talks, one after the other, and he would always go around the country saying, "This law is unprecedented," right? Why did he say it was unprecedented? Well, he said never before had Congress forced people to buy stuff. But this word unprecedented took on a life of its own. At one point, I actually joked with Randy we should make a drinking game where every time Randy says unprecedented, I'd take a shot, in which case I'd be on the floor in about 5 minutes because he would say it over and over again. So was this law unprecedented? In the narrowest sense, it was. This was the first time Congress had ever required people to purchase a product. The cases you mentioned involving Buck v. Bell, which is sterilization, That was the states, and this may be a concept you're familiar with, but the states have something called a police power. They have a general authority over the health, safety, and welfare of the people. Our federal government, Congress, has no such police power. In fact, the Supreme Court said Congress does not have that power. So, yes, it's true, states have required people to do stuff. A few other people mentioned, I think, voting, which is not voting, a jury service, and the draft. To the extent that jury service is required, I think it's actually required by the Constitution. How is this? You have a constitutional right to a jury. Where do these people come from sitting in your jury? Well, they have to come from people whether they want to be there or not. As far as the military draft, there actually were legitimate cases challenging the draft under the Slavery Amendment, the 13th Amendment, claiming the draft was more slavery. I'm not entirely persuaded those cases were wrong. But in any event, I think you can make a strong argument that the draft is closely tied to your civic identity and your national security, and perhaps can be justified. In contrast, making people buy health insurance, I don't think that flies. The other part of the question was, oh, this can't be unprecedented because these other laws have been passed without Republican support or Democrat support. Well, the two laws you mentioned were both budgets. And it's not surprising budgets were passed on a straight party line vote because a budget's not subject to the filibuster. The budgets are subject to what's called the reconciliation process. And generally speaking, our budgets are not required to be get to the 60-vote hurdle in the Senate. What's somewhat ironic is that Obamacare was passed under the reconciliation provision. Because Senator Ted Kennedy had passed away and died, the Democrats didn't have 60 votes anymore. So they had to actually use reconciliation to pass it. But what is true is that not a single piece of major social legislation, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the Americans with Disabilities Act, all of these laws were passed on a straight party line vote. And I think it's unmistakable the fact that the mere fact that the president decided to go this alone, he simply thought, oh, well, once we pass this law, it'll be good and everyone will be sing kumbaya and be happy. That simply proved not to be the case. So while the law isn't entirely unprecedented, and I concede your points, many aspects of this law were quite novel, which is why I think it's become such an important issue and lingers to this day in all these future cases. And by the way, I hear this really bad echo when I talk, so I'm taking my earpiece out, but I'll put it back in when I'm answering questions.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm able to understand the constitutional argument about the difference between the federal government and the states. But if I'm a citizen and I'm compelled to buy car insurance, it doesn't really much matter to me whether or not it's the federal government or the state government or the local dog catcher that's compelling me to do it. It's still an infringement, I guess, on my liberty. So. The question, I guess, is what is it then about this, about the federal government particularly, that makes this so compelling or so, I don't know, unprecedented, or gives it such power to offend, I guess, the sense of freedom of American libertarians and conservatives?
Sure. So two quick answers. First, people aren't required to buy car insurance. Drivers are required to buy car insurance. So presumably only people buying car insurance are those who want to drive, which is an important point people don't seem to make. Obamacare operates on you by the fact of your existence. The mere fact of existing requires that you buy insurance. But more importantly, absolutely it matters if the state or federal government. Why? Who's more responsive? Who's easier to throw out of office? One governor in a state legislature or 435 members of Congress and a president? Okay? Individuals have a much greater connection to the local government than they do to the federal government. I think this is probably true with your provinces in Canada as well. And one of the core aspects of our federalism is that the local government's more responsive, and that's why they're vested with these powers. The reason why the central government doesn't have these powers is because they're not responsive in the same way. So actually, I think it's quite true the fact that local governments can respond, and I'd be much more comfortable with my state imposing a mandate of buying a certain level of car insurance, because what if I say, wow, that's too much, let me lobby the state government and go to the state capitol, and we can maybe decrease the amount of insurance required. With Congress, you simply cannot do that.
Right. Anyone else want to jump into this subject? Yeah? Okay. Very good. We'll move to the next one. Well, on the car insurance subject, somebody brought up the question of Well, on the GM bailouts, the dollar amount is the equivalent to, say, forcing us to buy. That was an issue that was brought up. And at least when you're forced to buy a car, you have a car. Here, you're just being taxed and incentivized. Why? What's the big deal with the analogy in that sense?
Hmm. So unfortunately, we don't have much say over how Congress spends their money. Our only remedy is to throw the bums out of office, so to speak. Obamacare, in contrast, is not how the government spends their money. If the federal government wanted to spend money and give everyone health insurance, they could do that. But instead, Congress chose a different route. Rather than just paying for everyone's health insurance out of the general treasury, they decided to compel people to buy insurance. So while I may be morally opposed to the bailout of the auto insurance, think it's a waste of tax dollars, I individually am not getting imposed an assessment. Invariably, my tax money will be used to spend to bail out these worthless companies, that's for sure. But I'm not personally being infringed to have to do so.
Anybody want to follow up on this? Yeah, come on.
Yeah. Hi again. I still don't get the difference that you said it was largely unprecedented because it's the first time that Congress is compelling you to purchase something, and just fundamentally, couldn't you categorize taxes in the same regime? You are compelled if you view your income tax. I mean, it's not a direct purchase, and part of the power comes from you don't know directly where it's going to, but you're being compelled to pay your taxes. So while there might be a difference under the heads of constitutional power on whether they mandate a purchase or whether you have to pay your taxes. In a way, like the way you're referring to the government spending its money, well, the government's still spending my money. So I actually had made that original comment because, to me, in a sense, forcing you to buy a car while there's the direct purchase aspect to it. I mean, in the same way, it's still the government making a decision on how to spend my money. And even though there's all these judicial concerns about forced purchases, I mean, you said yourself that the government could, choose to buy health insurance that'd be fine for everyone. So I guess I'm not seeing the unprecedented factor there.
So had Congress actually passed a tax, right? Had Congress actually said those who do not have health insurance are taxed, that would have been perfectly constitutional. I wouldn't have liked that law as a matter of policy, but that would have been supported by over 200 years of precedent. That would have been fine. They didn't do that. They tried to wiggle their way out and use a different power. And under our Constitution, that power is much smaller than the commerce power. So means matter. When Congress says they're going to impose a tax, that would have been perfectly permissible. They could have imposed single-payer health insurance. They could have just imported Canada's health system, and that, I think, would have been probably perfectly constitutional. Right? I'd have no problem with that. But they didn't. They chose to use their commerce power, and where there were limits on that.
But as a policy, is it dangerous if the government can compel us to make purchases, that they can already compel us to pay our taxes and use that for whatever they want?
As a matter of first principle, I would agree with you, but the Supreme Court's held since the 1800s that Congress can tax activity it can't regulate. There were these cases going back to the 1800s where Congress tried to tax lottery tickets, right? A lotto ticket, right? And the Supreme Court basically said Congress cannot ban the importation of lottery tickets in this manner, but they can tax those who possess them. I mean, that's a case that's over 150 years old. So while I don't necessarily agree with it, those precedents exist, and Congress could take advantage of them. That our Supreme Court has held for 200 years that the taxing power is a lot broader than the commerce power. That's the world we live in.
I should point out we also read Spooner earlier in the semester, so
great!
Got a bit of anarchy fever here. So.
Oh man, Wayne, what are you doing up there? A bunch of Canadians are going to start rebelling and using their non-existent guns to overthrow the government. It's going to be terrible. We'll talk about the Second Amendment another time.
Question here.
I have a series of 3 questions I'm hoping you can help me with. So when it was first mandated that health care was to be provided to citizens regardless of their ability to pay, how was that received by the various hospitals, the for-profit, not-for-profit, and government-owned, and as well as the insurers?
Okay. So the law you speak of is EMTALA. It's the Emergency Medical Treatment and something Act. I can't remember. This was a law that was passed in the 80s. And it wasn't that you're required to receive health insurance. It's specifically that a hospital could not turn you away. And this is something that the hospitals were not crazy about because it results in uncompensated care. I don't actually know the history too much of that law. What I do know is that the hospitals absolutely hated it because they had to absorb all the costs. And then what ended up happening is this. The hospitals have to end up charging more to those with insurance, and then the insurance companies hated it because they had to raise the amount of money they were paying. So Impala really set in motion this, this series of events. Oh, my dog, sorry. And Impala set in motion this series of events that in large part triggered one of the core aspects of Obamacare. But to answer your question, I don't know the history of how that originated.
Okay, so my next part two. So when I think about that in a private sector type of regime, is that I would think that in itself is unprecedented. Force the private sector to provide a service without the receiver having the ability to pay. And I'm quite shocked that there wasn't a lot more state created basically because of that.
So I think the way it worked was like this. I don't have the bill in front of me, but I think it said if any hospital receives federal money, they can't turn away patients. Okay. Virtually every hospital receives federal money, right? They'll receive federal Medicaid or Medicare. This is a very common technique of the federal government. While they can't require that private businesses do something, they can say, okay, fine. If you want any of our money, you have to follow these rules. So effectively, any time any hospital receives Medicaid or Medicare, they're now obligated to treat people under this law. Your sense is actually correct, I think. The fact remains that by doing so, they're basically requiring businesses to provide a payment without any source of funding. There's an unfunded mandate, but this seemed to have not been as big of an issue as it turned out to be.
And then my third part, the last part of my question is, with government, including the government perhaps being able to tax and pay for the insurance themselves, and I was curious, in a capitalist market, how would they have selected an insurer? Or would that be up to the individual person to select?
Are you talking about under Obamacare?
Under Obama, well, you had mentioned a little while ago that the government could have chose to have passed this as a tax and then just paid for the insurance on behalf of each person. However, in the market, when there's various, like in Canada, there's one government-owned health insurance.
So the answer is there's a couple different approaches, right? You Canadians have what's often known as single payer. You have healthcare. That's it. There's only one option. You get Canadian healthcare, or the wealthy people come to America for treatment, which is what ends up happening. Too close to home? Was that too close to home? Okay. The UK has a slightly different system. So the UK has the NHS, the National Health Service, but they also have private insurance for wealthy people who don't want the NHS. So if I had to guess, what would have ended up happening under your proposal was we would have what's called a public option, right, where there is a federal government plan, which would be mostly for poor people who can't afford anything else, and the wealthy would still have access to private insurance and get whatever they want and just pay a significant cost for it. We're actually seeing that in limited forms where more and more doctors in the States are only accepting cash. You actually have doctors saying, we are not going to accept any federal money, we're not going to accept any insurance, if you want treatment, pay cash. And that way they don't have to comply with all of Obamacare's mandates. And I think as Obamacare metastasizes, we'll see that a lot more going forward.
Okay, we have a question from Justice Jackson.
Yeah, appreciating that. Hi, appreciating that. I don't know anything about your Constitution, or at least certainly not enough to talk to somebody who's knowledgeable about what you are. But when I reflect on the Supreme Court's history of Stone and Stone and the politicization of it, I'm wondering whether or not you can see that ultimately inevitable that the Supreme Court of the United States will have to take a step to try and legitimize their continuing. When you think that, you think that there's been in the past where the court has divided on political lines, and really there's no other justification for the decisions that they've made. At some point in time, the populace has to say, I mean, this court is essentially and it's not really second thought at all. So this was the opportunity for to do something votes. Establish the efficiency of the court as a distinct body.
Wow. So, Your Honor, the question you ask is an important one, which American lawyers talk all the time, right? Is the Supreme Court actually a court? Is it merely deciding political matters in the same way Congress would? So what I think I would reply to that in part, and this is somewhat of a, I realize I'm speaking to people who don't know our Constitution very well, but the president, who's an elected official, gets to appoint judges. The Senate confirms people to be judges. You don't get to be appointed to a court of any level without having some sort of political connection. Even if you're an academic who's appointed to the court, at least in the United States, you have some sort of connection to a presidential administration or you work there. When the president's appointing someone to a court, it isn't surprising that he'll want to appoint someone who sees things similar to the way he does. And in terms of American judges, we have a focus on things like textualism, or originalism, or limited government, or federalism. So it's really not surprising when judges appointed by Republican presidents tend to see things in a similar manner, and judges appointed by Democratic presidents tend to see things in a similar manner. So when people look at a lot of the 5-4 decisions coming down the court, I think in many respects you have to look at who the judges are and who appointed them. Remarkably, for much of the 1990s, we had two judges, David Souter and John Paul Stevens, who were appointed by Republican judges, but they proved to be quite liberal. It doesn't often work the other way around. So I don't think it's a matter of pure politicization. I think the judges are actually trying to interpret the Constitution in an honest and best way they can. But your question raises a different issue, right? You know, was it actually perhaps beneficial for the Chief Justice to resolve the case in the way he did? Did the Chief Justice, by doing something unpredictable or unprecedented, right? Did he actually save the court? And to answer that question, I'll answer it the way I answered the previous one. I don't think so. I think the Chief Justice's decision to rewrite the law in the manner he did more long-term damage to the court than another 5-4 decision invalidating the ACA. I mean, had the ACA been struck down in 2012, I think life would have gone on. I think we would have been able to continue existing. I don't think the world would have ended. People have been very angry about it. We've had another election, and then we've done something else. But now there's a new precedent, which is flying through that whenever the court's dealing with Obamacare, there's going to be a chance to intimidate the judge, say, oh, don't do this, because if you do this, people will die. There's an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief filed about a month ago, and the brief actually was followed by 4 people who said, if you invalidate this, we will die. I'm exaggerating slightly. But it basically said, we rely on the Affordable Care Act for health insurance, right? If the court invalidates this, we're going to die. We're not going to be able to have any health insurance, and we won't be able to afford it. You know, after the first decision, this is not an invalid form of attack, but I think it's very divorced from how courts should be approaching issues of statutory interpretation.
Okay,
Hi, Professor Blackman. Just another question regarding judges' decisions, the justices' decisions again. Do you think the conservatives, do you think the decision would have been different if conservative judges would have been amenable to compromise? Or it seems that they were quite uncompromising regarding their stance towards the legislation that they wanted the entire act struck down as being declared unconstitutional. And it seems like Chief Justice Roberts would want to compromise with them, but they didn't.
Okay. Thank you. So the question you ask is a good one, right? The question is one of severability, and I have no idea how Canadian law works in severability, but generally in American law, the way it works is if there's a part of a statute that's invalid and the rest of it's valid, you just chop out the invalid part, and that generally works. But the problem here is what would have happened if they would have just chopped out the individual mandate. Okay, if they would have just eliminated individual mandate, the entire ACA would have imploded, and I don't mean that lightly. The only reason Obamacare works the way it does is that the mandate forces the freeloaders, as someone called them before, the moochers, right? Obamacare forces the freeloaders to buy insurance now and not wait till they're sick. If that goes away, we trigger what's called an adverse selection death spiral. So you cannot have all the requirements of Obamacare to cover everyone and at the same time say you don't have to buy health insurance, right? So this made it very difficult. And actually the United States government agreed. They said you can't do this. The government said if the mandate is unconstitutional, you have to get rid of the entire damn thing, right? But let's look in another context at the Medicaid expansion. This is a portion of the case which we didn't talk much about, but basically told states, hey states, if you want to continue receiving all of your funding for this program for health insurance, you have to expand it and cover to more people. If you fail to do this, we will bankrupt your state, right? The correct remedy there should have been to strike down the entire program. But the Chief Justice says, let's rewrite it. Let's say, okay, states that want the money can get it, states that don't want the money won't. The problem there is that we now have this bizarre situation in the United States where roughly 24 states have this program to give health insurance to poor people, and about 35 states have said, screw it, we don't want it. So you have this weird dichotomy if you live in Texas where I live, right? Poor people at this level do not get the insurance. If you cross the border to Arkansas, just walk 5 feet. Now, if you're at the exact same poverty line, you're now covered. And it's this weird aspect that Congress would have never intended. So I think the act of saving part of the law, salvaging others, is really an act of hubris that the court was voicing upon as a law that Congress was never enacted. I think that's one of the dangers of this type of analysis.
Thank you. Any other questions on this? Okay, very good. This brings us to the, actually, you talked about the amicus briefs, and one of the students identified or asked, you didn't really talk about interveners or the amicus in this case. What role did it play?
Okay. So a fair question. So in this case, I think there were a record number of amicus or friend of the court briefs. There were a significant number. And perhaps the reason why I didn't talk too much about the briefs themselves is because the actual development of the argument over the course of 2009 to 2012 developed largely not in the briefs, but in the legal blogosphere. So there's a very popular legal blog in the United States, which if you're not familiar with, you should read, called the Volokh Conspiracy, V-O-L-O-K-H. And on the Volokh Conspiracy, there are a number of law professors who are mostly libertarian or conservative, and led by Randy Barnett. They developed arguments in large part about why Obamacare was unconstitutional. So usually constitutional arguments develop over the course of a decade. So think of the Second Amendment. It took 15 or 20 years to get enough scholarship to the idea that the Second Amendment exists and people actually said, okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Obamacare happened in the course of a few months. I discussed this white paper written by Randy Barnett on behalf of the Heritage Foundation. Well, look, Obamacare was coming down the pike. They needed something to stop it, and these really smart law professors come up with these arguments very quickly. By the time the case got to the Supreme Court, the issue was almost fully briefed. There was very little that had to be discussed. So I don't mean to minimize the role of the amici who followed in this case. The real hard work was by Barnett and Ilya Soman and Jonathan Adler, other George Mason alum, who were able to develop these arguments at a very early stage.
We had Randy come up here in 2008, speak on the right. So Randy's familiar to this law school.
Sorry, she's fine.
Okay. Another question that came through was, was there any follow-up to that? Another question that came up was, if the United States had, or if the United States Supreme Court or federal courts had to give advisory opinion, would that have the complexity of a litigation? In Canada, our Supreme Court can advisory opinions in the sense that the provincial or federal government can do what's called a reference case. So they can ask the question to the Supreme Court: is this constitutional before it's even enacted, or even after it's implemented? So would that have or not?
Well, right. So what's interesting, and if you guys have studied American constitutional law, you'll know that we do not have advisory opinions. And this was one of the first things the Supreme Court decided. So in the very early days of our country, Chief Justice John Jay received a letter from President George Washington. So we're talking the first President of the United States sends a letter to the first Chief Justice of the United States. We can't get any closer to the Constitution. And President Washington asked John Jay's opinion about some legal matters. I don't even remember what they were. But the content wasn't important. Justice Jay wrote a letter back saying, Mr. President, I'm sorry, we're not in the business of handing out advisory opinions. The Constitution says that we decide what are called cases or controversy. We decide live cases where people are injured. We're not in the business of just resolving issues in the abstract, right? So it would be unconstitutional for our system to provide what you guys know as an advisory opinion. But what I will stress is that in the past, when Congress passed a questionable piece of legislation, right, something that wasn't exactly sure if it was good or not, they provided an expedited appeal to the Supreme Court. So to give you an example, we have laws called campaign finance laws, and these regulate spending on various elections and contributions. And Congress passed one of these laws in the 1990s, or I'm sorry, in the early 2000s. And it wasn't entirely clear if this bill was unconstitutional. So Congress said this, all right, listen, we're not sure if this law is valid. Let's provide a shortcut to the Supreme Court. Rather than going through all three tiers of appeals, we'll follow a quick action in District Court and District of Columbia, and after that, the Supreme Court is a mandatory appeal. In other words, the Supreme Court can't decide whether to take it or not. You get a quick hearing in a federal district court in Washington. Now there's 8 different lawsuits like in Obamacare, and then we appeal. That would have been a godsend for Obamacare, because this would have resolved the entire thing in probably 6 months or 8 months. Instead, this thing dragged on for almost 2 years. Okay. What I will note is that the Obama administration was not in a hurry to get this resolved. At least initially, they wanted to drag this out, because the more people who rely on Obamacare, the harder it is to get rid of it, which is an unavoidable fact of life now. Contrary to what your native son, Ted Cruz, would like us to think, it's going to be very hard to repeal this law. But what I will stress is I would have loved to have seen a provision in Obamacare to say, okay, let's appeal this straight to the Supreme Court. Don't waste our time with all these other courts of appeals. I think that would have been a very salutary amendment.
Josh, it's 5 after the hour. Are you okay for a few more questions?
Yeah, you send me a few more questions. I can run through them. That's fine.
So the two, actually, I'll just merge the last 2 questions. One is, are judges usually this partisan, or was this an extraordinary, or as you would say, unprecedented case? And the follow-up to that is, will or has the Chief Justice continued his, for lack of a better word, compromising approach in other cases, or has he gone back to being the conservative he was? And what is the future of the Obamacare?
Mm-hmm. Right. So I appreciate the question. What does it mean for a judge to be partisan? I tried to answer this to your Honor's question a couple minutes ago. I think in many respects, judges come to the bench with certain priors, and have certain understandings of how to resolve cases based on text, based on federalism, based on history. So it isn't surprising that judges appointed by presidents of the same party see things similarly. What I do think, though, was actually quite partisan in this case was the extent to which the Chief Justice considered the political ramifications of his decision. And let me be very precise. The Chief Justice didn't just resolve this case on the grounds of federalism or whatever else. He said, or at least he suggested, because this would create a massive disruption in the economy and maybe impact their reputation of the court, I'm going to do all these hoops and jumps and leaps to try and find a way to save the law. I think that's a very partisan act. And to give you another example of a case pending at the very moment, which someone asked about future challenges, the Supreme Court's currently hearing argument in a case called King versus Burwell. This is a very arcane issue about whether the Affordable Care Act can pay subsidies to states that don't establish exchanges. The long and short of it is the text of the statute, if you just read the text by itself, it makes clear that subsidies can only be paid in states that establish these various Obamacare exchanges. Right? So this is a situation where Congress could fix this law in 5 minutes, right? If Congress was so inclined, they could pass a single sentence saying, okay, subsidies are passed everywhere, and that would fix the entire case. But our Congress has absolutely no interest in doing this because they also want to destroy Obamacare. So during oral arguments at the Supreme Court, Justice Scalia asked the government lawyer, the Solicitor General, well, if we invalidate this IRS rule, why can't Congress go and fix it? Okay, and the IRS, the government lawyer, basically said, well, this Congress, like sarcastic, but this Congress is going to fix the law, almost as if it's saying, this Congress won't do anything. And Justice Scalia shot back saying, what are you, crazy? We as a court are not supposed to get into such political matters. Whether Congress will or will not fix it is irrelevant. Our matter ends with whether Congress could fix it. And if they can, that's the end of the matter for us. So there's two aspects of this partisanship. On the one hand, is it okay for courts to consider these kinds of political ramifications, or should courts not? I actually lean towards the latter. Even if, as a matter of realism, we know the Congress probably won't fix it in the way Congress wants to, I think that's beyond the venue of the court to look into.
Very good. Anybody have any last questions? Steph?
I guess my question is, how should courts treat something that really is actually a tax, but it's not true as not a tax? It doesn't have tax in it anywhere. It's trying to hide it on as a tax. So let's say Chief Justice Roberts was actually, his reaction to the ACA was just, he read it and went, this is a tax. Should he find it unconstitutional just because of that? Because it approached it trying to hide this tax, or
Right. So I think, sorry, I hear an echo, so I have to pop the ear out. So I think the answer is this. I would have loved the holding of the court to say, when Congress wants to impose a tax, they have to say it's a tax. They need to use a clear statement. I would have loved that holding. That isn't the court holding that we got. The court made clear that in the event that it's unclear maybe, or maybe even if it's not unclear, the court said we will save the law to uphold its constitutionality. I think that sends a clear message to Congress going forward. When in doubt, just leave it ambiguous, leave it unclear. Hope the court bails you out. I don't think this is a particularly good part of the holding of the case.
Any other?
Hi there. My name is William. Thanks so much for taking time today to talk to us. One question, and maybe Justice Claxton can speak on this point too, is revolving around one of the themes of your book, is judicial activism. I think your argument that the Chief Justice did some jumping through hoops in order to find the acts valid has some merit to it, but I think there's also a counter argument that the Chief Justice was respecting the elected bodies that enacted the legislation in the first place, and hence was trying to keep the courts out of deciding what was best for the American people. And just because when it was passed, it wasn't a Republican-dominated Congress, doesn't mean the judicial system should come in and sweep in for them. I was just wondering what you think about and Obama used that clearly in the interim between the two decisions. What your thoughts was on how I think the argument for judicial activism is just used to beat down on judges when you lose.
Right. So I appreciate the question. I mean, this issue of judicial activism and restraint is one that goes on in our country, and I'm sure it goes on in yours as well. It's absolutely true. Traditionally, judicial restraint says you respect the branches of government, you respect their elected decisions. And I'm sure the Chief Justice said, well, even though Congress didn't perhaps write this bill as they could have written it like this, and as a result, we'll uphold it. Right. So that in one sense is respect for the elected branches, but also it involves something of a fantasy world because that wasn't the law that they passed. Again, if Congress had passed a law imposing a tax on not having health insurance, under prevailing law, that law would have been fine. I think any respect for Congress should respect the law they wrote. What the Chief Justice did was something very different. He rewrote the law and gave us a law that was never enacted. So with respect to the Medicaid expansion, Congress intended all 50 states to have Medicaid for these poor people. Now, 3/4 of the states don't have it. Had Congress known that this is what would have happened, they probably would have written a very different law and would have made the conditions so draconian. But here we are. So when judges attempt to play politics on both sides, both in terms of striking laws down or rewriting them, I think they go outside their area of expertise, and they probably cause more damage than they're worth. We now have an Affordable Care Act that exists that was not the one Congress designed. The Medicaid expansion exists in only half the states. I discuss this in my epilogue of the book, but the individual mandate is not going to be high enough. It's not high enough to work, and eventually Congress will have to raise it, but because of the Chief Justice's opinion, it's now going to be unconstitutional if it's too high. So we have this weird facsimile of Obamacare that keeps getting rewritten and chipped away and chapped away. In that sense, I think Justice Scalia's suggestion that we just start from scratch, although perhaps is fanciful, perhaps is the most respectful to the Democratic branches.
Thank you. Any other questions? Come on, Chris.
Hello. I just had a question regarding the nature of, I guess, the political process and what happens when laws are struck down in the U.S. I know here in Canada, when a law gets struck down, the court has the option of essentially delaying the effect of that striking, so that something as dramatic as 10 million people losing their health care, the government has a year or so to remedy the problem in a way that is constitutional before that takes effect, so that it's not essentially the court depriving these people of their health care. It would be the government, and again shifting the responsibility for doing things properly back to the government. Is there similar such provisions in the U.S.?
So it's really funny to ask. So there's currently a case in King v. Burwell which discusses these subsidies. And during oral argument, the Justice Alito suggested that the Supreme Court could put its ruling on hold till the end of the year. Usually the Supreme Court says within 45 days of the decision, that's it. After 45 days or so, the opinion issues, and that whatever law was invalidated is now gone. But in very specific, narrow circumstances, a court can put its ruling on hold. It's somewhat of a weird result because, again, this is purely a political act. If the law is unconstitutional today, it's unconstitutional tomorrow, it's unconstitutional in 6 months, right? Why are you letting the government continue operating something that's invalid? But the court has some sort of equitable power that's exercised before to blunt the impact of its ruling. So we very well may see in the short-term future the court put on hold a ruling that could devastate the Obamacare markets in about 34 states. But your instincts are exactly right.
Thank you.
Any other? Okay, Josh, thank you so much for your generosity of time and knowledge and taking time out of your day. I think we're going to adjourn for here with respect to the class, and we're going to continue in about 15 minutes in our other room discussing this book. So undoubtedly your Q&A will provide us with a lot of stimulating and ideas and discussion. And again, thank you so much for taking the time out.
Thank you so much. Have fun, Canada.